So how have you been?
Been okay. Uh, yeah, just kind of busy and busy not doing much.
Busy not doing much. Tell me more about that. What do you mean busy not doing much?
Yeah, it's really hard to put my finger on, but there's just something very different. And like Europeans who come over here say it, like one of the Ukrainian ladies who got sponsored to come over here from Romania, who goes to our church. It's awesome. But like she just talks about like how it's so different. There's just a feel like you just feel like you're always busy. And I think a big part of it's probably commuting. It's like
Yeah.
over there, your community is pretty immediate. And so here, I mean, you have neighborhoods, but nobody's ever out in their yards, hardly ever. Most of what you do is you drive to your church, you drive to your work, you drive to your school. And at least here in the Atlanta area, but I think it's pretty common across the states, like your commutes are probably 15 minutes minimum of
Yep.
wherever you're going to go.
Yeah, I think that's pretty fair. Yeah,
Yeah.
I feel that. I mean, this last week I had a lot of that going on. Some like actual productive work, don't get me wrong, but a whole lot of driving around and getting from one place to the next. And some of that is exacerbated by, having to come down here to LA. Like we were planning to come down here for Thanksgiving anyway, but those travel plans got moved around a little bit because of some family, situations. An elderly relative, got ill and passed away. It wasn't entirely unexpected, but the timing was. And so, we drove down to LA 4 days earlier than we planned to. And then I got on a plane to come back so that I could finish some stuff for, work and be physically, up at this ranch that I've been doing some stuff at. And so, driving up there, having meetings, the week is just gone, just because of all the commuting and back and forth and all of the hustle, bustle, busyness. So I get that.
Yeah. Yeah. And I think just with kids, life is different too. Um, it's just there's always something, I don't know how many times we've said, okay, well, after we recover from this sickness or after this event or whatever, okay, then we're gonna start our routine. We're gonna be able to do this. We're gonna be able, our life is gonna be, we're gonna kind of be leveled. And it just doesn't happen.
Yeah, Natalie will tell me, basically that, it's like there will never be a time when you're not busy, when there's not something, happening. And so it's sort of funny, it's like, oh well, when are we going to do this thing? Because we don't do it now, it'll never happen, kind of an idea. So she has it's helpful, sort of her perspective. It adds a sense of urgency to some stuff that I would like to put off because it's like now doesn't feel like the right time. But
Yeah.
if now isn't the right time, then there will never be a right time. So I get that too. I don't know. I don't know. I'm definitely feeling that in this season. So I don't know what's on your heart in this season, but for me, there are a couple things. There's one thing that I would drop everything else to do, and that is, if I have the opportunity to do some work with HHS, either volunteer or paid or otherwise, sort of with the new administration, I will do that. I kind of have a burden for that on my heart. It's like there's a timing of it too, like with everything that's happening, where I kind of feel like it wasn't my plan, but I definitely feel this like opportunity that's like this door that could be open and that I should walk through if that presents itself. Um, and then, there's some stuff I would like to do connected with that, sort of similar, which is really around long term. How do we find and place really capable, qualified people into civil service. So that's sort of a longer term vision, but somewhat similar to, sort of the thing that compels me to want to do, some work with the health and human services if the opportunity presents itself. And then, the other thing is something I don't necessarily want, and I'm kind of hoping that this other group of investors gets their act together and buy this ranch that I've been doing some work with. But if they don't, I kind of had to have this burden on my heart to like make that happen. I don't know if it will. I think I've got all the pieces to put it together. It's just a matter of connecting the investors with the opportunity, and I think the opportunity is really big, and I can do those three things. But right now, I'm doing a whole bunch of other stuff that I would have to stop doing if those things came together in the way that I guess I hope they do. So I don't know.
Yeah, it sounds exhausting. I mean, like your aspirations are like, you know, government agency, the top of the lands, or, multi-million dollar ranch. But I'm doing all this normal, like everyday work too. So I don't know. Like my
Well,
aspirations aren't, I'm like, man, I'm too busy to mow the lawn. Gosh.
well, this is the thing that's so interesting. Like, I guess the amount of work you're going to have to put into anything that you're doing is going to take the same number of hours out of your day for the most part. There might be a little bit of movement around the edges, but there is an upper limit to the number of hours something can take from your day, right?
That's true. Yeah.
So if you're going to sleep, I typically sleep 6 or fewer hours in a night. I've been trying to move the needle on that, but even when I give myself as much time as I would like to sleep, I don't really sleep on average more than about 6 hours a
Yeah,
day.
yeah. Your body wakes up.
So now don't get me wrong, I do better if I get 6 hours every day, and that's not like how I've been operating. I've been operating with like the sort of sawtooth thing with my, sleep. If I wear this, this ring that tracks, sleep and all this kind of stuff in it, it doesn't paint a nice picture. But the other thing is it's built around what an average person should be expecting to get. And so I don't know. It's helpful as a benchmark. I find it useful to force me to change some of my behavior so I get better quality sleep, but I don't necessarily take its guidelines around the total amount of sleep that I need because I just find, I'll just wake up earlier, like even if I'm, doing all the things I should be doing. But it's gotten me to change like setting an early alarm if I don't have to. I'll just like let myself sleep until I need to wake up. I find I do much better if I
Mhm.
do that. Or I'll set an alarm later because sometimes I find myself thinking I'm going to get up earlier and setting an earlier alarm and then a later, like sort of fallback alarm. And I should always just set the fallback alarm, like never set the like early
Yeah.
ambitious alarm because my ambitious alarm means that I'm getting like almost no sleep, which is like
Yeah.
no, you know what I mean? It's like, so no, I should set the one that's like 6 hours.
Right. Yeah.
um, no, I guess it's interesting because a couple of years ago, I thought my life was sort of, I don't know, on track for what I was anticipating, but also at the same time, I wasn't gonna reach what it was that I had sort of on my heart to do, doing the things that I was doing. Because you just sort of like sit down and calculate, okay, God, um, what's going to be required to do all these things that I have on my heart? And you go, a lot more money than I can possibly make myself. And it's not like I want to like have all of this money so that I can have a nice place to live. I mean, these things are all great, but it's, just simply looking at, okay, what is it projected to cost per person to do this thing I want to do around civil service. And you sit here and you go, well, it's probably about $10,000 a person to find, equip, and place a really capable, competent civil servant. And that's about, 10 to 20% of 1 year's wages, depending on where sort of in, the in their career, where along their career you find them and equip them. But let's say on average, like if they stay, it'll be about 10% or less of like 1 year's wages to find them, equip them, and place them into a position where they would be a good fit. And that's comparable to what, and maybe a little bit less than what, that cost is in the private sector. Like in the private sector, you're probably talking, more like 20 or 25% of the first year's wages is sort of your placement cost, right? With a external agency or something. And so it's like, okay, it's at least in the ballpark. Like maybe it's a low estimate, but it's in the ballpark. I think that's reasonable. Maybe we can be a little bit more efficient and bring that cost a little bit lower, but probably not too much if you're really doing all of the things that you want to do. And then you think about how many people there are in civil service now, even if the current Trump administration is really aggressive in what they're doing in reducing the workforce. How many people are you going to have in the federal workforce? Well, right now you have close to 2 million. So let's say that you're only trying to, affect 5% of that, right? Let's say you're only trying to find, equip, and place 5% of the total workforce. And that would be, thinking about that, like over 20 years, that would allow you to fully replace the current workforce, and sort of, be helping with that whole, process. You're talking about, you're talking about 100,000 people. And that's just at the federal level, right? So much less at the state level. And I'd like to do some things within the state of California. But at the federal level, so you're talking about 100,000 people. You're talking about $10,000 per person, and you just do the math. Well, that's $1 billion, So you've got to figure out how to go and raise $1 billion for a nonprofit, like the way that I currently envision it being structured. And I'm not going to be able to self-fund that. No matter how successful I am, if any of the ideas I have for various businesses were to be successful and I go spend 5, 10, 15 years executing on them, it's possible I could then have $1 billion. But to do this, it's like make a choice. You can either have the money to fund something like this 15 years from now, or you can spend the next 15 years finding, raising, getting the money and doing this thing. And you get to the place that you want to 15 years earlier because you've been able to, start building, growing, getting other people involved. And in the end, anything that you're going to do, it's going to take people. It's going to take other people's time and energy. And that's what costs money. Like money is just a way to leverage other people's time. And so I need to get really good at fundraising and, getting ideas in front of people and connecting with people who are like interested in investing their hard-earned resources into accomplishing that vision that I can lay out for them. So I don't know.
Yeah. Sounds very overwhelming to me. It's not my type of thing. I'm glad there are people who can do that.
Well, meanwhile, we've got these guys, who have billions of dollars of capital, and what they're doing, so you take like Vivek and Elon Musk, and these guys are trying to figure out how we streamline the efficiency of our federal agencies. And, um, they're talking about trying to have a multiple $1 trillion impact, right? So it's like, even my biggest dreams, right? Like, at the moment, in terms of like the level of impact I want to, sort of have, and, the things that I want to accomplish, it's like, that's like 3 orders of magnitude, like off of what these guys are talking about doing just this year. So you see, you go like, the question I have is it ambitious enough? No,
Well, if they succeed at whittling things down, there would be a lot of people who you could leverage their time. They'd be looking for having their time leveraged.
Well, it's not like there's a shortage of things that need people's time and attention, right? So I'm not as anxious about some of these things, especially when you're thinking about like the government workforce. So because I used to be a civil servant, right? And so my view is, after having spent 9 years of my life in civil service, much of that time was spent doing something called pre-market review. And it's actually something I'm going to be advocating that the new administration figures out how to do less of, and invest more of their time in enforcement and compliance and sort of post-market. So instead of being pre-market and sort of reviewing stuff before it's on the market, you want to invest more of your time and energy after products are on the market. And there are a number of reasons for that, because the people who come through the pre-market process, they're the people who are following the rules anyway, and they're likely to be lower risk. The people that you catch in the market doing things, they might have skipped that whole process. And so you want to catch them sooner rather than later. So like the people who are trying to be compliant, the people who are trying to follow like safety regulations, like these are not the people you're worried about, right? And the
So you're
fast
saying you would still have those regulations, you just wouldn't spend a lot of resources having people check that they're following the regulations beforehand.
You would leave a lot of that in place. There's some things like just within the current framework that you couldn't change, but you could, under the current paradigm, sort of tell companies that we're deeming you approved, or, like for clinical studies in particular, you could tell them, look, you can start your study in 30 days unless you hear from us before then. We don't plan to review your documentation. If you want us to give you feedback, then you can follow up. And a number of companies will want to follow up and get FDA's input anyway. But a whole lot of studies that could just start without FDA input will now just be on a 30-day clock to start.
So
And that
I think what that sounds like, oh, I know this isn't what you're saying, I'm pretty sure, but what that would sound like to a lot of people is, oh, hey, now companies can just go ahead and do whatever they want. And if it hurts somebody, oh, well, there were no regulations for them to follow.
So this is the thing that's so interesting about that, because right now there are a bunch of other people who actually take care of looking at the safety of clinical studies. So you don't actually need FDA looking at it. FDA is one more hurdle that, for the most part, from my perspective, is actually unnecessary. So they should be doing the post-market like data integrity checks. So some of what they do with this group called BIMO, they will go around and inspect and make sure that like people collected the data appropriately, that you can trust the integrity of that information, that kind of a thing. But this pre-review that happens, that FDA does a lot of, you don't actually stop a lot of harmful things from happening when FDA does this. One, because these groups called investigational review boards already do that work. They already look at studies to confirm safety, and they're a lot closer to it in the institution where this is going to happen. And they have a lot more sort of close ties with the investigator who's going to do that study. So there are a lot of reasons to sort of defer locally to those groups from a safety standpoint. And then, even for FDA approved studies, there are harms to patients that happened in these studies. And so you can't stop all harm up front. But what you do with the current scenario, sort of with the current paradigm that we have in place, is you slow down innovation, you slow down how quickly a company can get into research and learn what works and what doesn't work, and then adjust. And so you actually, for a lot of people who have really serious life-threatening illnesses, it takes longer for them to get life-saving therapy when they have no other options because of the paradigm that we have up to supposedly, protect their safety. And so it's just we have these misaligned incentives in how the system is set up. And so rather than expecting FDA to stop all kinds of harm, which by the way they don't do anyway, you just take them out of the loop where they're slowing down the process, and then you ramp up where right now they don't spend enough time protecting people early. There are all kinds of companies, and I've seen this, where there are quality issues for products that are on the market, and FDA does not take action very quickly. And the company is not taking action because the incentive is for them not to, especially very large companies. The incentive is for them to not take action on certain issues that are sort of at a threshold where they should be taking action. For something that's really, really seriously bad, usually they'll take action on their own, not necessarily always. But so you want FDA involved in more policing, but you don't want them involved in sort of upfront like approval like processes. It's like the difference between um like planning review at like a city versus like an on-site inspector coming out and making sure that everything looks fine, right? So you want a much more streamlined planning process, and you want a much more involved sort of inspection, like after the fact, or like once it's installed, but before everything's sealed up, you want somebody to come in and look, make sure that, okay, yeah, this looks fine, go ahead. Like that kind of a thing is really what you want. And in some cases, like that's like overkill too. Like there's some kinds of projects where you don't need an inspection. There's not like a structural issue. There's not a safety issue here. Like somebody replaces their floor from carpet to wood. Like there are some cities that require you to like file a bunch of paperwork for that. Like from my perspective, that's like crazy. Um, and it's the same kind of thing with like FDA. You get the same kind of stuff where there are certain changes, there are certain kinds of new products where, yeah, you want FDA to like come in and do an inspection, but you don't need them to look at a bunch of paperwork necessarily before they just come and do the inspection. You just want them to come and make sure that there's nothing really egregious happening, or if there is, to flag it. And then the other thing is you can have them spend a lot more time chasing things that are already causing patient harm. So like right now, our system prevents a lot of hypothetical harm while allowing a lot of actual harm to happen. Whereas what we want to do is not worry too much about hypothetical harm that will become real harm, but focus on the actual real harm that we know is happening, that if we invest more resources there, we can reduce that. And you just end up getting better overall outcomes if you tweak the system that way. Um, but anyway, that's just sort of my, just my take on it. And like for FDA overall, I think you can probably do a lot of that with fewer resources, but most of it is just the allocation of those resources to get the desired outcome, right? So you can get much better outcomes and much less burden on companies who are trying to innovate in a space and really solve serious problems that patients are dealing with, like real things that are hurting people. You want to free up companies to solve those problems, and then you want to focus on, sort of those people who are in the market who are trying to do a bunch of cost cutting measures to, and cutting corners that are
Yeah.
actually patients at risk. So you don't want to slow down the person who's solving a really big problem that's killing hundreds of people a year right now. You want to like let them go as fast as they can to try to solve those
I mean,
problems.
I mean, that's essentially what they did and how they justified the speed of the COVID vaccines, right? They said that, hey, this is so
Yes,
important, we're gonna like rush this through, and we're gonna be willing to deal with
but
some risks.
but that part of it I don't have an issue with. The part I have an issue with is the mandate. So like the reason that I get so bent out of shape about the way that COVID was handled is not that they moved quickly. It's that they moved quickly and then they required you to start administering this to vulnerable patient populations or advocating that you do.
Yeah.
Like we should never have advocated that you inject this like across the board for pregnant women or that you inject this across the board for children. We did not have that kind of data. Now, could you like recommend that older people get it based on the data that we had? Absolutely. But should you be recommending that young healthy people get it? Probably not. Young sick people, maybe. So there are like edge cases where it made sense to do what we did, but it was the combination of moving quickly and then mandating that people do this thing. That's the problem. So like
Yeah.
I'm all for like moving more quickly with the medical technology we have access to, but then putting it in the hands of patients and physicians to make their own decisions about whether to use it or not, using the information that's available,
Do you
right?
think
Not
that would be hard for if I'm a doctor and you put that in my hands, like, hey, you're free to do this, but now you don't have, like it or not, that the FDA as a government organization carries with it, I would assume carries with it more weight than whatever whoever's reviewing it before that, because you've got the government behind you. So if I'm a doctor and the FDA isn't on the front end of it, and now I'm like, am I going to take the hit as a doctor for like what is there to protect the doctor in making an ethical, informed decision that just ends up not working for the patient?
the doctor always carries a certain amount of liability. I don't see this increasing or decreasing that. One of the things, a lot of people talk about is limiting some of the liability protections that companies have, um, which I think in some cases might be reasonable. But I'm much more of an advocate for giving patients and physicians tools and then allowing them to use them. So I'll give you an example. So my daughter has recently been diagnosed with an autoimmune condition, okay? And there is a drug that Regeneron makes, which anecdotally, from some of the people I've talked to who have had their own experience in using this for some similar kinds of skin conditions, it probably um, has a chance of helping her not just stop the progression of this disease, but possibly reverse it. Now, I'm not saying that everybody should go out and take this drug for this condition, but I actually, of all the things I've looked at, I would have the most peace if I was going to give my daughter a drug. And right now, we're trying to focus more on reducing her overall inflammation through diet and environment and trying to take some steps to like sort of give her body a chance to kind of reset a little bit. And we'll see if that works. But the drugs that the doctors have recommended that we take, all the data suggests there's really no hope of reversal with those drugs. Those drugs won't actually stop the progression, except maybe briefly. And then you'll have to go on the drugs again. You come off the drugs, go back on the drugs. And from talking with some other physicians, like they're not a fan of those drugs in terms of what the long-term effects are to, bones and other things that like they've seen with people who've been on these drugs for a long time. They don't like what they see in those patients. And so I say to you, I don't have peace about that drug that I'm being recommended that my daughter should take. But I do have peace about another drug that's not currently labeled for that use. Um, I'm not saying everybody should go and use that drug, but I'm saying that my daughter should have access to that drug for this condition. Um, when, from a well-informed physician and with a well-informed patient, right? That we should have the ability to use that. Um, there's some question about whether we can or not, but of all the drug therapies I've seen, that's the only one I would currently have peace about. I'm not saying like we're not even currently jumping to go do that. But of
Right.
all the drug therapies I've seen, there's one, and it's currently not labeled for that use. But that's the one drug that I have some hope might actually work to reverse my daughter's condition and might actually help her if the things that we're doing right now don't work. And so more people should have that kind of access. And I believe drugs should mostly be labeled for safety, not for efficacy for any particular like condition. I think there's like it's useful to have access to the literature. It's useful where maybe there's reimbursement for certain types of uses, but I do not want FDA making decisions about drug efficacy because what
Mhm.
I've seen from FDA is that they're reasonably good about making determinations about drug safety. Even that's questionable, but they're pretty bad about making determinations about drug efficacy from what I've seen. Like, especially when you're expanding into new claim territory. Some of the drugs I'm familiar with, I mean, FDA will allow a drug to be labeled for additional claims when there's like a 10% difference over placebo with a whole bunch of added side effects. Now, should somebody be able to use it for that condition? Yes. Should it be labeled for use in that condition? I don't think so. I think that's like malpractice.
Yeah.
It's the same kind of thing like with my daughter. Like, should it be labeled for that condition? I don't know. But should my daughter be able to use it? I think so. So, like, that's at least sort of my like thinking about how we should go about this. And I feel the same way about, devices. I do think for foods, we need to like have a much tighter control around food additives, around, chemicals that are used in processing, both for sort of like raw agricultural products like wheat and, corn and, for anything that's, got an ingredient list. You don't even have to put all the ingredients on the list, if it's below a certain, amount. So just the way that we've gone to mass manufacturing of food is really sort of problematic, I would say, for human health. And we probably need more regulation on food, which is ironically like in the next administration, they're going to be trying to deregulate, except with Robert F. Kennedy Jr. as the HHS secretary, they're actually going to be ramping up sort of like
Yeah.
regulation probably around
Yeah.
food. He doesn't have direct control over that. Like he's not like directly in control of like agriculture.
Yeah.
So there'll be another secretary he'll be working on, with on some of that, but they do have a lot of oversight at FDA, over various food, labeling and food products. So he doesn't have complete control over sort of the food supply chain in terms of like moving the regulatory needle, but he has a lot of control over that. And he's gonna probably be pushing for more food regulation and probably even some more regulation around drugs and vaccines, quite frankly, which is kind of interesting. And we're seeing an immune response by large companies, to some of that news. So anyway,
Yeah.
but I
Yeah.
know
Yeah.
we have limited time. I don't know if there were a couple other things that maybe you want to hit on before you have
No,
to.
no, no. I'm fine with that. Yeah, it's interesting. I go on and off of Instagram, and I've been seeing a lot of videos come through recently, probably in light of sorry, what, Kennedy,
Yeah.
um, in light of him coming on, um, where they compare like, Canadian Fruit Loops to American fruit, and you're like, man, it seems like it would cost you so much more money to run two lines of something when you could just do one thing. And how is it adding more chemicals, more like how do you make more money off of adding more things into it?
Shelf life, more vibrant colors, so people are more likely to buy it. There it's an interesting thing where um I think a lot of it's around shelf life, which most foods that have longer shelf lives, most preservatives I think are sort of problematic. I mean, I get why we went that direction. We were concerned about a lot of food spoiling and people starving, but we've now seen a lot more human health like effects of these preservatives. So I think we need to move away from a lot of these preservatives, away from a lot of these additives and colorants.
But if you're the cereal company, you're going to sell it to the store. If it goes bad sooner, they have to buy cereal sooner.
Not exactly how it works is oftentimes you are just paying for the shelf space, and until your product sells, you don't get paid.
Ah, okay.
And if your product goes on sale, you get paid less. And at some point, you're getting like pennies on the dollar for what it costs you to make the thing. And then you go out of business, depending on like sort of what the situation is. So, um,
Mhm. So is that, I mean, you might not know this, but that would make sense how a whole brand could go on sale because if they pump out a product that has a similar shelf life and they recognize that shelf life is kind of coming to a close, they can put all of those things on sale simultaneously.
yep.
Hmm.
Yeah. And that definitely drives, and some of it is supply. It's like, well, we're coming up on making the next run of product, and this product is about to run out of shelf life. So we're going to try to pump it out. We're going to, maybe adjust the amount we make the next time around. But, we're going to try to get as much of this off the shelves as we can as quickly as possible because it's about to expire. And if it expires, now it's worth zero, right? So like we want to get the milk off the shelves before it goes bad. We want to get this cereal off the shelves. So I think a lot of these cereals have probably like almost an indefinite shelf life. So
Yeah.
um a lot of it I think is just about how quickly they fly off the shelves is faster when you have like these colorants and other things in them. And I do think some of the regulations we have in place make it easier for big companies to just put preservatives in their food rather than comply with certain other testing and things. So oftentimes you have a choice between, sort of using some basic additives or doing a bunch of extra testing to figure out, what this looks like. And so I think oftentimes they just, take the route of adding this or the testing that they did had that preservative. So now they're kind of stuck with using it or doing a bunch of new testing.
Hmm.
And so I think that's what drives a lot of this is, we've been doing it for a long time. I do think though, if they're already making it and selling it in other countries, the ability to quickly convert over to making it that way should be possible in sort of
Yeah.
US manufacturing facilities. They might even be making it in US manufacturing facilities and
I
selling.
think especially for like Canadian products,
Yeah,
yeah.
like you're making it in the same facility. And
Yeah.
you've got two recipes. One
Well,
is the good one, and one is the one you feed us.
mm. Well, I think it's kind of indicative to me that I remember when I learned, well, this was a long time ago. I don't know if they still own them, but where I was like, you see all the subsidiaries, and they're
Yeah.
like Philip Morris owns Kraft. Like that's kind of weird and like ominous too. You're like,
Well,
I
I'm
wonder if they
saying
run their food business different than they ran their cigarette business. Well,
no. They
of
use
course
the
not.
same
Yeah.
scientists. You know this, right? They use the same scientists who were figuring out how to make the tobacco products as addictive as possible and marketing it to children, right? They took those same guys after a bunch of legislation was passed around tobacco products and they moved into food. And you actually find the advertising looks eerily similar for food products as it did for tobacco products before some of this regulation came into play.
Man, you can tell
It's
that we're a Christian nation because I mean the manufacturers and stuff based it's basically like the VBS strategy. Oh man, get all those kids in. Like pictures, stories, like shiny.
actually, I'm surprised. Actually, did any VBS curriculums include like, you
Flannel
know,
graph.
Fruit Loops or something, because it matches the right colors for some of the beads and stuff they were doing. I'm trying to
Probably.
think. Um, no, it's yeah, it's bad. It's pretty bad.
Yeah.
Oh, I forget who was talking about this. But uh I forget which Kelsey brother it was, these football players. Um they were doing some advertisement for cereal, you know, and they ate like, I don't know, a bite or something of it on the commercial. And it makes you wonder how much of this do they ever or have they ever actually eaten? I can't imagine this is part of their diet today if they're in peak physical shape. Like maybe they did it as part of the commercial. It's almost like the thing. Did you ever see that thing when Obama went to Flint, Michigan, and then he took a sip of the water
No.
and he just sort of put it to his lips, like you know, he like you could tell like there was like none of this water that went into his mouth. He did this as like a publicity stunt to like drink the tap water in Flint, and even when drinking the tap water as a publicity stunt, he didn't even drink the tap water. Like if you've got to go see the video of this at some point. But like it reminds me of that, like these sports stars like eating the American junk food, whatever it happens to be. It's like
Yeah.
there's no way that they're eating this on a regular basis. Um, I don't know.
Mm. Yeah, it's just more and more depressing. And the more rabbit holes I go down and learning about tobacco and food and then, governments and coups and exploitation and like it just the more I learn about history, the more it's just depressing.
Wasn't there something about Dole and the was this the whole thing that happened with Hawaii,
Chiquita.
or was it somewhere else?
Yeah, there was Hawaii and the annexation, or I don't know what it was, but yeah, the
Was
overthrow of
that
Hawaii.
driven by Dole or was it somebody else?
I don't know if it was I don't know if it was Chiquita Dole or if it was something different, but yeah, it was definitely I don't know if it was sugar. I mean, sugar was in like, other places too. Like Cuba was big sugar.
I'm
But
trying to remember, but like, and I'm trying to remember, but yeah, some of these like food conglomerates, or like sort of
yeah.
plantation, sort of syndicates, however you want to think
Oh
about
yeah,
it,
like the
sort of
Banana
driving.
Republic, the Banana Wars.
Isn't that funny? Like it's actually like the thing that we say, Banana Republic.
Mhm. Yeah. Yeah, and I mean learning that like was it Panama? Who knew that that's a relatively new country? I mean, we essentially created it, I think, out of Colombia. We
Yeah.
kind of pick a side in the Civil War. We end up kind of backing the people who get Panama so we can have the canal and everything. And
You just
Um,
annex the part that you want, you know.
yeah, and
It's what empires do, right?
it is. And we're one of the best at it.
It is interesting though. It is interesting though that we didn't annex that much territory. What are
Like
your thoughts on
land.
that? Like, yeah, like actual land, like there was some expansionist, some expansionist, kind of stuff that happened early on, and definitely like with the Philippines and with Hawaii and with Panama and some of these areas. Um, but a lot less expansionism than I would have, like, I guess, expected
Yeah.
from, from the
I think that's an
Americans.
easy answer. I think
What
that's an
is
easy
it?
answer. I think you learn a lot about how overextending yourself is very difficult. Like logistics is very difficult to control that much. Um, and especially as you get more towards faster transportation and communication and industrialization, which is a big one, it's a whole lot easier to control territories without having to actually control the land. So
Mm.
there, so the book, The Veins Out of the Veins, what was the one that you recommended?
Yeah, the veins, sorry, the open veins of Latin America.
Yeah, I mean he talks very clearly about how slavery ends, like it coincides with industrialization and a lack of like and if you look at when Britain ended slavery, like there is a huge coinciding with their interests. It's like it's just not fruitful for them anymore. It's not like they had this big, huge, oh, you know what, we're so wrong. There's I mean there's some of that, but a lot of it is, hey, you know what, it's in our interest right now. Slavery's not really that beneficial. And France just lost Haiti and stuff. We can kind of get them to stop it too. And hey, if we're not doing it, we don't want other people to do it and have it be lucrative for them. So
Yep.
we're gonna kind of make them stop it. So anyway, the and there's another book called Confessions of an Economic Hitman, and he talks about it very well, where he says, "Look, my job, I would go to another country, you use the IMF and the World Bank, and you basically say, hey, you know what, we'll give you these loans, and then all of a sudden they're indebted to you, and you control them. So
Yep.
when the world runs on your currency, you control land by debt. Like at this
Yeah.
point in time, you don't need to have physical troops on the ground in another country. You control it through the world economy. And
Wasn't England more closely aligned with the South in the Civil War as well? Or
so,
am I
yeah,
missing something there?
there was cotton. They were,
So it wasn't like, as far as I can tell, it wasn't like a principled stand on slavery. Not to say that like the Civil War was exactly fought over slavery either. That's the like convenient sort of imagining of history to a large degree. Um, but it is interesting, like, the stand, as far as I can tell, is sort of opportunistic, much like the US intervening in foreign conflicts where we're
yeah,
not always on the side of democracy. Like, interestingly, if you actually pay attention, um, we're kind of opportunistic.
yeah, usually not actually. Um, so yeah, there's another good book. I'm trying to like this, The Vast Southern Empire or something like that.
Hmm.
So he talks, I don't remember if he talks specifically about Britain, but he talks about how, ironically, today you think of Southerners as conservatives who want small government. And he's like, actually, conservatism and big government, like it was a lot of the Southerners who were in governmental positions. And he gives a lot of really good evidence about how the South wanted to expand the empire and how the
Yep.
South was very involved in big government, which is just
Well,
interesting.
that was the reason for the Revolutionary War in many, ways as well, is that the settlers wanted to expand. And as far as I can tell, like some of it's not just the expense of the expansion, but England was trying to figure out how not to lose control in all of this because of the way that Parliament was managed. their concern was, as far as I can understand, that if you were to give representation to the colonies, like the colonies were demanding, within some short span of time, the colonies would basically run England, and they didn't want to lose that control to the colonies. And the colonies wanted to expand. And so I think there was this like push against that expansionist, sort of, uh, I don't know, desire on the part of the colonies because it was costing the crown quite a bit of money, um, to just do basic like defense of the colonies. But then the other thing is, I think, there were these sort of warring concerns about that expanding population and the way that Parliament was set up, if they were going to then give representation to these colonies and keep these colonies sort of within the empire. I think it was sort of a matter of time for the colonies to be cut loose anyway. Um, I think in many ways that, that war, I think both of us are sort of on the same side, of this one. It's sort of an unpopular view, I think, these days, but I think the Revolutionary War was an unjust war. And I actually think that, you would have had a lot of good outcomes that would have happened if the colonies had just been, willing to sort of wait it out a little bit longer. I think you would have had a lot less bloodshed, a lot less, sort of loss of life if the colonies had taken a slightly different path. And they would have, I think, been like sort of set free from Britain anyway, because I don't think it was going to work for Britain to keep them in the empire.
Yeah, I
Because
mean, you can look at the trajectory of Canada and not, I mean, who knows what it would be. You can't extrapolate everything, but if you look at Canada and how that turned out with them in Britain, you might say something similar could have happened.
yeah. And I don't know. I mean, it's hard to go back and make any, sense of this. I think in many ways the founding fathers of the US made the most of a bad situation because they weren't even really seceding. They were sort of papering up what the populace had already decided to do. I mean, the population had already decided to revolt against Britain, and they just sort of decided to pick a side, as far as I can
Yeah.
tell.
I mean, I think there were a lot less revolutionaries than we think there were. I think in our minds, we're thinking, man, everybody was just against Britain, except for maybe a handful of people. I think, I don't remember the numbers exactly. I want to say it was like 60-40.
Yeah,
There's a significant amount of people who are loyalists,
yeah,
um, because Britain, like they had a low tax rate in the colonies. The soldiers, the professional soldiers defended them, and they weren't really putting in their share of money, to have the soldiers support them. And yeah, when you had like George Washington, who's a land speculator, they get upset when you stop westward expansion. Um,
I I just think it's interesting though too that we still it was such a big deal about the boarding of troops. I mean, and like thinking back on this too, is talk about like not in a time of war. Like troops were being boarded in houses, and there was a constant threat of, sort of even if there wasn't like an active war happening, there was a constant threat of violence on the borders of, sort of empire, right? And so it's so interesting to me that there was this just sort of violent backlash against, sort of like, you look at just our the Bill of Rights and how this is all written up. It's very interesting, sort of from a modern point of view. And if you go back and actually think about what was happening at the time, um, and then what rights basically we've given up in the current sort of modern era, like we're not really honoring a lot of these sort of founding principles, so to speak, that got outlined. I mean, um, this is just like a deep irony in some of this for me, that, basically the Bill of Rights lasted, I don't know, was it even a dozen years or something until, basically, they'd started being ignored. Was it even a dozen years that it survived?
Like what, wartime, like
No, it
of
wasn't
the
so much like quartering of troops, like that
no,
was a
I was
big
thinking
thing. Like
the
there,
silencing of the press, the free
the
speech
side,
stuff.
yeah, the free speech like died pretty
Yeah.
quickly. At least the freedom of the press. Um, you know, I don't know. Like, I think a lot of this, like, pretty much disappeared fairly
Yeah.
quickly. I don't know about the Second Amendment and sort of protections there, but definitely in the modern era, like, this is not, sort of as wide-reaching as I think the Democrats would like you to believe, and is not as sacred as the Republicans would have you
Yeah.
believe. So it's just
Well,
kind of interesting.
there's some really good stuff on the Second Amendment. I don't know what I think at this point, and I don't think that the discussion today is around what the modern, like, I don't think their intent is where it is today. I don't know what their intent would have been, but they can't foresee. They couldn't have foreseen where we're at this point in terms of weapons and stuff. But it is interesting that you don't really see anything about the Second Amendment until like the 60s, basically, when you've got black people start carrying guns in the California
Well,
thing.
and that's actually it's a leftist, sort of a thing, and you get a crackdown on leftist revolutionaries in
Yeah.
terms of access to weapons, man. It's wild. That is
Yeah.
wild.
Yeah. The history of
Um,
it is it's a whole lot more complex than both sides probably really care to entertain.
well, yeah, and then you've got the expansion of the administrative state under basically at least starting with Abraham Lincoln, you had a massive expansion of the administrative state. You continue with an expansion under Wilson and FDR um, and under Nixon, it sort of runs off the rails. I
Yeah.
think shortly after Kennedy and Lyndon Johnson were pushing some of these great society ideas.
Well, it's interesting.
But
You mentioned Wilson. I think a lot of people skip over him. And I didn't know anything about him until I was studying for the propaganda season, and I read a book about his
what do you think
administration.
about Wilson?
Wilson was one of the interesting ones to me. So there's a lot that goes on in his administration, but talking about free speech and stuff. Um, there was this filmmaker who came out with a film called the Spirit of 76.
Yeah,
And so there's this Supreme Court case, the United States versus the Spirit of 76, where this guy, he creates a film about the Revolutionary War. And there's like a 5 to 7 second clip of, just like, here's a scene, here's a scene, here's a
yeah.
scene, just 5 to 7 seconds. And in there, there's the implication. I mean, this is like 1918 or something, or 15, whatever. It's like not graphic. It's super black and white, whatever. And it's just a British soldier bayoneting a citizen or something, or like the implication that he's going into a house and you're like, oh, he's going to rape that woman probably. Um, and this guy gets 10 years of imprisonment because it's sedition, because he is painting our allies, the British, in a bad light, even though this is about the Revolutionary War in 1776. And but because he's making it in wartime about one of our allies, he gets 10 years in prison. That gets like commuted to a shorter prison sentence and like fine. But nevertheless, the fact
Yeah.
that he gets that, like, man, it, yeah,
No,
our
yeah, that's
freedoms.
that's horrifying actually. The other thing that's so interesting is this sort of push because you had it at the time of the Revolutionary War. I'd say you had it under Abraham Lincoln, you had it under FDR. I don't know so much about Wilson, but definitely sort of shortly thereafter, you have this push towards really empowering a single person with just an unbelievable amount of authority. They tried to make George Washington a king, and then Lincoln effectively was in terms of, his power in wartime. in the Civil War. And FDR, you know, basically, basically ruled in the same kind of a way. He was sort of an ultimate executive, like with all the power in his office. And so we've had these moments, even though they've been presidents, where we've given these people, sort of, almost king-like status. And with George Washington, we actually tried to make him a king. And now we're coming into a second administration for Trump where, the Democrats have like for quite some time been clamoring about this like concern about, sort of that. And they get then trolled by conservatives who like sort of double down on this idea of sort of like God Emperor Trump or something like something like
Yeah.
this, some of these memes, and they just sort of lean into it. Not necessarily because I think the conservatives are looking for that, but it's like it is interesting. There is this tendency towards wanting a very strong executive authority. And I think we have that to some extent, even though he's looking at rolling back most regulations and almost like disempowering in some ways his office, at least from what he said. And I believe he'll probably execute on that. There is this leaning towards empowering a single person with a whole lot more authority than our system is set up for. It's sort of interesting to see that happen time and time again throughout history in this country and in other countries.
Well, I mean, they keep setting precedents for it with like executive orders and stuff. So it seems like the powers build on top of each other. You set this precedent and it doesn't get knocked down, and then you can just keep the previous precedent and make a new one. And it just seems like a little stair step. It doesn't seem like it's that big of a deal. But when you look at the precedent, the last recent precedent versus the first one, you're like, man, they got a lot of power.
Yeah, I don't know. It's overall, I would say, concerning. I don't know what to do about that one. I would like to see the rolling back of some of the excesses of the administrative state, which I think we'll see happen in the current administration, or I should say the new administration coming up here in January. Um, yeah, I'm hoping we don't get some of the, sort of really bad outcomes, but I don't know how you control the expansion of that sort of executive power.
Well, I mean,
Um,
here's the thing. We will see his true colors, the administration's true colors, because they've got a whole lot of power this time around,
yeah,
and it's Trump's second go. So unless he changes the law or something, it's his last run. He doesn't need to think about reelection.
yep,
He can go all in and do whatever he wants. So whether that's for good or for ill.
we'll see. Yeah, we will see.
You know,
Um,
interesting. I haven't seen anybody talk about this. I'm sure somebody's mentioned it, but he's I think the only president other than Grover Cleveland who's done a split term. Is that right?
that's my understanding.
And it used to be, I don't know, this is a old wives' tale, but it used to be that they said two was it like two in a row was unlucky or something, or maybe that was Grover Cleveland's like excuse for why he. But I'd be
Why he
interested.
split his term.
Yeah, I'd be
Well,
interested in in what his second term was like, and then like in sports they always have these stats like, well, every time it's a third down when they're leading by 7, they this happens. They're
this
99%.
happens.
So it'd be like, Grover Cleveland's second term was a fiasco. Let's see. We can start to keep stats on split terms.
Well, Teddy Roosevelt tried to do it but didn't achieve it. Sort of good riddance. He didn't get 3 terms. Um, but he got really close to doing it. It sort of split, but he would have done 2 and then 1 or something like this. Um, you had FDR. He had 4 in a row. Uh, um, I don't know. It'll be interesting to see sort of how some of all this plays out. But you know, it is interesting how memeable sort of real life is when a guy with the name of Trump, can't stop winning. And that's like, like just in cards, it's like, oh, you're playing, it's just there's so much hilarity and kind of to some degree how all these things come together. And maybe it's just because our brains cue on those things that you can latch onto and grab like that, and you ignore all the other things. Um, but it is kind of interesting. So I don't know. I don't know.
Hmm. Yeah, it is interesting what you said. I mean, how we see them as kings, because there's a whole lot of messianic language from the Trump crowd about Trump, and you see a lot of people on the other side who are critical, but I think the irony there is that I've seen a lot of people on the other side who essentially think the same thing. They just think that instead of a Messiah, it's, the Antichrist. And it's like,
Yeah.
I mean, you're treating him like a Messiah, like a kingly figure, just as
Yep.
a negative one, and they think that their lives are just over. But
Well, I don't know. It'll be interesting to see how some of that plays out. You do see some people have like after the election sort of found some degree of sanity in all of this where they're not, at a fever pitch screaming about, the end of democracy anymore. And at least not for the moment. I'm sure they'll pick it back up again in a couple of years whenever the next, election comes around. But like that's the thing that's so interesting. Like I watch Bill Maher talk about some of this stuff, and um, he's sort of gotten to the point where he did his last show, I think, for the season and said, he's basically not going to let, Trump get under his skin effectively. I don't know, I'm paraphrasing him, but that's basically, what he said, sort of like closing this out. And that basically, the Democrats have, been over the top in, some of the things that they've, said. And now, like sitting down and meeting with, literally Hitler kind of an idea, because like you're
yeah,
calling him Hitler and now you're going to like peacefully give him power. Like, okay, guys, like, make up your mind about what's happening in reality. And so he's kind of over some of the rhetoric, I would say, at the moment. You see that from other people. You see, some of these hosts from, some of the cable news stations going and meeting with him and trying to kind of like make peace or something, at least a show of it. And I don't know. It's going to be an interesting thing to see, sort of how some of this works out. I am optimistic about what we'll see with Robert F. Kennedy Jr. I don't have a lot of, sort of hope about the rest of what's all going on, except, maybe there will be some work that will come out of like what Elon Musk and Vivek are doing
yeah,
going to get us on a sustainable trajectory as a country in terms of what we're doing with our deficits and with our debt. I do think that that's important to get onto a better, more sustainable trajectory, but I'm not going to be too worried about the rest of, these things. Um, I think having somebody like a Tulsi Gabbard in this DNI role, the Director of National Intelligence position, I think that will be probably a push towards keeping us out of war. My only concern there is, if the people reporting up into her like don't share information with her because of her sort of contrarian views on some of this stuff, which might lead to some calamities and problems. But I like having some of these kinds of voices who hopefully will be keeping us out of World War III, even while the current administration is giving long range missiles to the
yeah.
Ukrainians to provoke Russia. I just, uh, I don't know. Like I'm a little bit discouraged by sort of the saber rattling that we see the current administration doing, and I have to say I'm somewhat happy to see what the outcome was based on that. Because I think if we were seeing a Harris presidency start, I imagine we would just be going deeper and deeper in on the Ukraine war and on some of these things that I think we need to be.
Which just
Um,
blows my mind because I would have associated the Democratic Party with wanting to stay out of that, but
well, they
guess
did
I'm
get
an
an
idiot.
endorsement from the Cheneys, if you remember.
Oh,
So,
Halliburton, Mr. Halliburton.
you
Isn't
just sit
that
here and you go like, and she, like, it's one thing to get endorsed by the Cheneys. It's another thing to go around campaigning with a Cheney and celebrating that sort of support. That's just shocking to me,
yeah,
you know. But maybe nothing should shock me.
yeah,
I don't know.
yeah. Well, that's interesting. We agree on a lot of things for sure. We need to talk
Yeah,
about
and
something we probably don't agree on next time.
I know there are some things we don't agree on, but
Yeah,
we'll get to that
yeah.
next time.
We could talk about Israel Palestine next time. That we might not agree on that one.
I think we might agree on that one too, actually,
Yeah.
overall. I mean, in general, I want to see more peace and less war. And my view generally is when if the outcome of your conflict is more terrorists in the future that you have created because of your conflict, I don't think of that as a success. And my view is that in general, um, until the old men get tired of seeing the young men dying, we're not going to find peace. And the problem right now in Israel Palestine is that the old men are not tired of seeing the young men dying. And the same problem is true in Ukraine.
Yeah, I mean, I think we're in a very nihilistic age. And so I'm trying to put myself in their shoes. If I'm on my way out the door in the next decade or two, what do I care? I mean, if it's about my legacy, if it's about what I have now, if I mean, get what I
It's your
can now.
children and grandchildren. It's about the future.
Yeah, Putin
I
probably
mean,
has like 100 children and grandchildren that he doesn't even know.
yeah, but how does this help Russia? I really don't see the Ukraine conflict helping them. I understand why they got into it. And I think that in many ways we provoked or helped to provoke this aggression. Um, I don't think it's like I'm not supportive of it, but I can
Yeah,
understand how we got into this situation. And I don't know why I believe our diplomatic core basically got us into this situation on purpose. I think they wanted a war of attrition with a proxy against Russia. I think that was the
yeah, of
goal.
course. Yeah, of course.
And my problem with that is I don't think that should be the goal. The goal should be peace. Well, be careful about saying, peace in our time kind of kind of rhetoric or something. But like, you know, uh, really, it should be, an aim for peace instead of war. I mean, Chamberlain's name is like, mud because he was appeasing, the Germans right before World War II. But I believe that there are ways of navigating these kinds of negotiations without being, um, that um, that weak. I think you can be strong while still pursuing peace.
I guess I don't know what other option Russia would have if like so there are a couple options. Win-win, which is peace, right? Win-win. Like you win, I win. It's going to involve some sacrifice from both sides to get that compromise. Then there's win-lose, which Russia was in, right? U.S. encroachment, U.S. like encirclement, same thing around China. Like US policies and stuff hurt them severely. So what? Like they just keep getting closer. They keep messing with them. They keep messing with Russia, proxy war Syria, create more terrorists there, like all kinds of things. And it's like at some point, if you're Russia and it's like, okay, they're winning more, we're losing more. Okay, they take another step, they're winning even bigger, we're losing even more. It's like at some point, it's like, I know we're already losing. So rather than make it a win-lose and just let them get away with it, hey, I'm fine with a lose-lose. If you're never going to let me win, lose-lose. So you're right.
And
Russia
and
doesn't
it's a
win.
bigger lose for Ukraine. I actually think overall it's a bigger lose for the US than it is for Russia in the current scenario. So I actually think a peaceful settlement at this juncture, I mean, it would have been better for the war not to have started. It would have been better to find peace at any point in time before now.
Yeah.
But the best outcome for the US is still peace. Because I actually think it's a bigger loss for the US than it is for Russia for this to drag on.
Yeah, because look, I mean, Russia is uniting with North Korea. Not that they weren't friendly before, but to actually be fighting side by side, like to
Yeah.
have North Koreans on the continent, like in Europe-ish.
Yeah.
I mean, that's a big deal.
Yeah.
So
It,
the US and they're continuing to veto resolutions against Israel in regard to Palestine, that like the global community, there are uprisings in a lot of different places in the US too, but not so much as there is in like Amsterdam and
yeah.
other places. But like we are totally ostracizing the global community.
Well, I find some of the positions on Palestine at US universities to be slightly psychotic at the same time. It's like both things can be true. Like the way that we're supporting Israel can be problematic and should be handled differently, but also the opposition to Israel and the way that some of this is communicated and handled is also like psychotic. Like I think both of those things are true.
Yeah, I guess it, and this is where it's hard for me because like as a pacifist, I'd be like, yeah, sure. But
Mm. Except the opposition to Israel is not pacifist. That's what you
well,
like.
no,
It's
that's what I'm saying.
yeah,
Like as a pacifist, I'd be like, yes, I agree with you both, but like that's insane. But if I'm coming, like think about it. If I'm a US patriot and I'm all pro 1776 because our tax rate went from 0% to 2%, and like I have uh,
doesn't that really put the you just put an edge on that one?
yeah, and like I understand the representation thing, but like they're way over there. They don't have that. Like there was salutary neglect prior to this, where they're
Yep.
just like, "Hey, we're gonna let you do whatever the heck you want." And they're like, "Okay, we let you go a little too far. We need to put a rein on this." So, if that justifies a revolutionary war in U.S. patriots' minds, and
Yep.
then you think of Palestine, you think of the Nakba, you think of the Intifadas, and you think of the nonviolent things Palestine has tried to do over and over
Mm.
again. You think of kids throwing rocks who get bullets in their head. You think of the targeting of press. You think of absolute destruction of kids, like tens of thousands of kids at this point, or at least, between 10 and 20,000. Um, it's like you're telling me that that doesn't justify a revolution? Like, I understand that as a pacifist, what Hezbollah, what Hamas does, like, I don't think that's good. And there are a lot of the Palestinian Christians are actually pacifists.
Yep.
And they put out a resolution at the beginning of the war. But how does that not justify their actions against Israel from your
The,
own standards?
the thing I don't know how we get to is empowering the pacifists in both Palestine and Israel. How do we empower those people? Because the people who are currently in power in both places are the old men who are not yet tired of seeing young men die. not the pacifists. It's not the people that want peace who are in charge. It's the people who want absolute and utter victory over their enemies who are in charge in both places. I mean, the folks in leadership in Palestine want to see, from the river to the sea, sort of violent rhetoric. And the Israelis are happy to slowly take all the territory and uh with no thought for the human suffering of the Palestinians, because we can other them. They're aligned with terrorists. They're aligned with our enemies, so we don't care if they die. Like that's the current, I think, view of many of the Israelis, and I think that's really not good. That you can say we're going to be okay with all of these children who are the next generation suffering and dying and basically being turned into terrorists because of what they've seen, and sort of say, well, it's not our problem because they're under the control of terrorists. And then what we're going to do in response is, you know, horrific too, without really a thought for how we save these children from horrific conditions that are going to turn them into terrorists. I don't see anybody talking about what do we do with this place and how do we handle this population in such a way that we don't turn out the next generation of terrorists. I don't hear anybody talking about that. And that's what Israel is doing. They're creating the next generation of terrorists by their actions.
So I think the answer to that, like when I think of, you said, how do you empower the pacifists in each community? So when you think about the civil rights movement, two of the most powerful times that spurred action were Emmett Till and the decision of his mom to do the open casket. And she said, they're going to look at what they did to my son. And then the other one, I think it was the March to Selma, where it was like televised. You have peaceful protesters who are not attacking anybody, who are just walking, and you have dogs sicked on them. You have fire hoses shooting at them. And one of the major powers of nonviolent action is that people think, well, how is just walking down the street going to work? And it's because you put on display true reality. So when you walk down the street and you don't lift a hand and you have people viciously attacking you with dogs and with water hoses, like that's not a philosophical argument. That is like tangible reality. I can see who is evil. Like I can see the
And
light and I
and
can see the
and
darkness.
who is good? Yes.
And so
Yep.
one of the major powers of our media, a lot of people focus on what the media says. And yes, that's important because Hitler says whatever you do, say it a lot and say it often. Keep it short, say it often, say it frequently. So there is power in what you say, but a lot of the power that our media has is in what it doesn't say. And
It's
what
omission.
what
Yeah.
happens is if you go on Instagram and you start following Palestinian journalists and you don't even have to read what they say. Watch the videos. You
Yeah.
watch the videos of who's coming out of the rubble and you look at the pictures of parents weeping over their children. Like you see very clearly where darkness is. And our
Well,
media
it's
doesn't
it's
show you.
also it's also the implication though. So that I was listening to somebody talk about this. It's both sort of sort of what you're omitting, but also what you're implying, right? And I think in the Palestinian conflict, there's a deep implication, and there's some truth to this too, but there's an implication that the Palestinian population is aligned with Hamas. And the problem is there are a whole lot of victims in that population that are not accounted for there. And at some point, if your children were being murdered, you would actually have similar sorts of sentiments, right? And you would not hold that against someone whose children were being murdered, that they held, you know, these kinds of sentiments against the people that murdered their children. So it's like both things can be true, and this is where a lot of the narratives break down, because the narratives are trying to find an easy way to communicate who's good and who's bad, and we're going to lump all the Palestinians in with Hamas. They're evil is sort of the media narrative right now, I would say, for the most part, from mainstream media at least, and that Israel is doing, God's work of protecting innocent Israeli citizens. And I would say that's obviously propaganda, right? Because it's the same thing with like Ukraine. Ukraine is on the side of good and Russia are evil. It's like, I'm not saying Russia is good, right? I'm not saying that the people in Palestine are completely innocent. Like, don't get it twisted. Like, just because the narrative is wrong does not mean the narrative doesn't even mean that truth is the opposite. It's just that the truth is a lot muddier than the narratives that we are trying to tell the American populace and maybe the global populace. I don't know.
Yeah.
So I
Yeah.
my prayer is for peace, and sooner rather than later. And I hope that in both of those conflicts, that the new administration will have more people who are pushing for peace than in the current administration, because the current administration, as far as I can tell, is only escalating global conflicts and looking the other way as other conflicts escalate. I don't see us actively working to reduce conflict and end war. And I hope that does an about face with the new administration. I mean, that if that happens, then like that will be good, right? And whatever the rhetoric, whatever the media happens to say about it, if we have less death and less destruction in the next 4 years, I'm going to take that as positive, and I don't think that there is such a thing as a perfect leader or a perfect administration. Um, but I'm aligned with some of the things that some of the people in this new administration are trying to do around health, around reducing war, and expanding sort of the focus on peace and prosperity. Um, yeah, I want less death and destruction, man.
Yeah.
So both
Well,
at home and abroad.
right.
So
Well, that was more than 30 minutes, a little bit, I think. So
I think it was
I need
quite
to
a bit
get going.
longer than 30 minutes, but I'll
Uh,
let you get to sleep. I appreciate your time as always. It's
yeah,
always good
same,
talking with you.
same. We'll do it
All right.
again.